Hello. Welcome to our webinar, Cybersecurity Risk and Your Board. I am Steve Etzler with Business Development Institute. First, I'd like to welcome and thank our speakers, Beverly Allen, Associate General Counsel, Chief Privacy Officer for Inovalon, and Jeff Crisci, Senior Director Modules for Diligent. And of course, thank you to our sponsor, Diligent, for making this webinar possible. And of course, thank you to you, our attendees, for investing your valuable time with us this afternoon. We have a very simple agenda. The webinar will run for 30 minutes. Jeff and Beverly will have an interactive discussion about our topic, Cybersecurity Risk in Your Board. The webinar is being recorded, and we will make the recording available after the event. So with that, let's begin. Jeff?
Thank you, Steve. First, I'd like to introduce Diligent. Diligent is the leading provider of secure corporate governance and collaboration solutions for boards and senior executives. We actually have over 5,000 clients now and over 300,000 users in many countries around the globe. These companies use Diligent to provide secure, intuitive access to their most sensitive and confidential information, ultimately helping them make better, faster decisions. The Diligent Board solution speeds and simplifies how board materials are produced, delivered, and collaborated on using iPad, Windows, and web tools, removing security concerns of doing this by manual methods such as couriers or through common electronic methods such as email and file sharing. Please visit us at our website, www.diligent.com, to learn more about the Diligent platform. Beverly?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the introduction and for having me. Inovalon is, in short, a healthcare technology company that specializes in big data analytics and cloud-based platforms in support of the transformation from volume-based to value-based models across the healthcare industry, as well as the assessment and improvement of clinical and quality outcomes and financial performance. The key to Inovalon's analytic capabilities is, in large part, its extensive data sets, which includes, among other things, data pertaining to more than 230 million unique patients, and that clearly presents significant data protection concerns. The engine that drives all of this is the Inovalon One platform, and that's a business intelligence solution suite that combines more than 80 of Inovalon's technology tool sets to form one integrated platform. And our clients run the gamut across healthcare, including health plans, health systems, hospitals, providers, and pharma. In terms of my role, I am the Associate General Counsel and Chief Privacy Officer at Inovalon, and I'm responsible for leading the enterprise-wide privacy, HIPAA, compliance, and risk management functions. Thank you.
Thank you, Beverly. So I think Steve covered this pretty well earlier in our webinar, but we'll touch on this again. What we're going to cover today is essentially a Q&A. I'm going to pose some questions to Beverly, and then we'll both weigh in on many of those topics with respect to how cybersecurity needs to be considered at the board level, and talk about different relationships within the board and the executive suite, and how they need to be considered in light of cybersecurity. So with that, let's go ahead and jump to our first question. Actually, I think the first question is our role, and I think you just shared that in part, Beverly, so let me just jump in and share my role at Diligent. I am the Senior Director of Modules, as Steve pointed out, and what that means at Diligent is modules are a value-added solution suite that we bundle with our Diligent Board solution. Boards is the core platform that's used to collaborate securely on board documents, and then we offer 3, soon to be 4, different modules for value-added services. And those services are secure messaging and an evaluation and a questionnaire tool for doing things like risk surveys and director and officer questionnaires. And then early next year, we're actually adding a minutes-taking module. So I spend a lot of time talking to directors and senior executives at companies about how to apply those tools to their board operations. Beverly, was there anything you wanted to add about your role and how it relates to the board of directors?
Thank you. I think I covered my role pretty thoroughly. I would add, with respect to the board, I do attend board of directors meetings regularly and present on privacy and cyber risk topics as well as other legal matters, and that is a standing agenda item on the board agenda.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let's start. Certainly, cybersecurity and cyber risk is top of mind for everyone now, and you only need to open the paper or any website any given day to see all the different, scary stories that are out there. But Beverly, what are the high-level cyber risks that your organization is thinking about right now?
I would say because data is such a critical component of our work, I mean, we have routine and regular discussions just around protecting data assets. In terms of the specific cyber risks, I would say there's a consistent focus on external threats and insider threats, as well as third-party risk, in particular vendor risk. So we place a very high level of attention on those areas. The third parties go through kind of rigorous vetting and routine auditing and monitoring to make sure that they're compliant with our requirements.
And just a follow-up question from my perspective, because you're in the healthcare space, do your requirements essentially stem in part from what's required under the law in HIPAA, or is your level of security even going above and beyond that from a due diligence standpoint?
Really, I mean, HIPAA for us is really just a baseline. Our security requirements and privacy and security controls really exceed that which is required by HIPAA. So they're HIPAA requirements. There are also some other requirements that we address that are promulgated by CMS. In addition, to a large extent, we try to parallel a lot of the federal requirements, so NIST 853 and other federal drivers. We also try to integrate those into our control sets.
I see. Thank you for that. And, from our perspective at Diligent, we're in the security space. We're a vendor of security software. So we are constantly innovating, constantly making updates, and constantly putting new controls and processes in place to make sure we're staying ahead of the curve from a security standpoint. And just operationally, every employee at Diligent, from the lowest level employee to the highest level executive, are constantly going through new security, knowledge-based training and operational training to make sure that we're well prepared to serve our customers at the board level. And what would you say the role of the corporate counsel plays in the overall management of the risks that Inovalon or other companies may face from a security standpoint?
Well, I think the counsel plays a key role in that we are working across the organization. So the interactions that I have and my colleagues have are across departments. They're multidisciplinary, and they really are what I believe link and connect the different business units and departments together so that people understand that they're not operating and should not be operating in a siloed and independent kind of autonomous way, but that we really need to be coordinated, not just in terms of particular requirements, but just in terms of the overall security posture enterprise-wide.
Yeah, one of the things that I consistently hear from some of the corporate counsels I deal with, and just even friends that are in that role in different companies, is that they really fear a lack of control, and they fear the biggest risks are the things that they have no control over. And a lot of times that comes down to the ways people are communicating, I think. Do you spend much time thinking about how folks are communicating and worry about that in your role?
Yeah, I think that's an important part of what I try to people tend to perceive both legal and compliance as impediments to getting things done. Security is often also seen in that same way. So a good deal of what I do just in terms of strategizing has to do with, how are we communicating? How is the team communicating? Are we being interactive? Do people see us as an enabler rather than an impediment? So I do think that communication is a very important component to what we do and really getting things done. I mean, providing legal advice and legal guidance, that's one thing, but getting people to listen and getting it to resonate is something else.
Sure. Okay, thank you. And how do you and Inovalon handle educating the board and senior executives versus the average employee? You know, a diligent, every employee goes through a little security training course, of course. How does Inovalon handle this?
In terms of the content, I pay very close attention to how training is being messaged. So, for example, for senior executives and the board members, training tends to resonate better when it's aligned to strategic objectives, risk management, and bottom line. I also am very aware of trying to make sure that there's not a lot of technical jargon included in that type of training, since in particular the board members aren't involved in day-to-day operations, so that's not really necessary. Another thing that I support and encourage is recurring training with, or periodic, I'll say, more focused one-on-one sessions with the executives and the board, more so the executives here, but just to ensure an understanding and to have an opportunity to provide additional insights or provide that kind of opportunity where they can ask questions. I think that's really critical, as it's the senior leadership team who affirms the importance of the training, reinforces the principles from a high level, and is ultimately responsible for ensuring that their areas of workforce oversight complete training.
What would you say is the role, or can there be a good role for vendors in this? So, for example, Diligent, of course, is a vendor to the board, the corporate governance and board space. And I think one of the challenges that we often see is that directors sometimes can be slow to adopt new technology. They can be set in their ways at times and want to do things their own way. How can vendors, maybe develop processes, training, or other tools to help customers get their board and their executives to adopt the right approach to cybersecurity and all the various aspects of that?
I think one thing that could be done is to really, at the outset of any new engagement or new contract, is for vendors to proactively and voluntarily share their training and share their training approach. In many instances, there seems to be a tension with some of our vendors, such that they see the training requirements and other related requirements that are part of the contract as a burden. But I've learned in many instances vendors already have fairly strong or strong programs and processes in place, but there's not that kind of two-way conversation where there's that sharing. And I think that would relieve some of that pressure and perhaps even help. I know, Inovalon would be receptive to understanding and learning what other people are doing, because we're always interested in leveraging best practices, but there's really a lack of communication in that regard, I think, with vendors and other contractors.
Interesting. Yeah, one of the things I found with one of the specific products that we offer, the messaging product, is folks tend to assume it's a fairly simple tool and that we all message on a daily basis, but it has much better security capability than your email or your typical messaging solutions. And folks perceive it's easy to use, which it is, and will be easy to adopt. But we have very specific processes in terms of how we'd like to roll it out and train people on how to use it. And because it's perceived as being pretty simple, we often get resistance to that. And I think that can sometimes hamper adoption when the customer doesn't necessarily embrace the education process that a vendor might bring to the table, especially with something as important as cybersecurity. So I'd love to see us foster better partnerships with our customers so that they really embrace our approaches and best practices that we've developed internally to rolling out those solutions. And I think we'll all be more successful for that as time goes on.
Mm-hmm.
So are you taking any special actions right now with respect to communications or board level security? And one of the things, as I mentioned earlier, that this messaging application we have, it's intended to replace email. So for example, how are you, in particular, stopping folks from forwarding emails, that you might send for board information to their personal accounts, or how do you make sure board members aren't communicating secure information in insecure ways? Is that a concern?
I think that's always a concern, but in general, I approach that as a strategic effort rather than being solely tactical. I mean, I've heard some instances where companies and other organizations will say that they simply, for example, we're going to disable auto forward, or we're going to restrict external email traffic, but that's really not practicable in an environment that has significant external facing, such as clients. Once employees or others start forwarding emails in that manner that you described, they've essentially undermined the security and governance policies that have been put in place, assuming they are in place. I know that Inovalon has them in place, and I hope that other companies do as well. Really just designed not so much from a regulatory perspective, but really designed with a specific focus on protecting an organization's information and intellectual property. As far as kind of the enforcement around this, that's really, in my opinion, driven by the policies. Sending emails in an insecure fashion is simply a policy violation. There are other situations, or many companies have user agreements that are signed upon hire, and I know with board members there are other confidentiality agreements that are signed upon joining that contain language that prohibits those types of practices. So, I believe that the policy is really what drives this. I just think in terms of it adversely impacts the business if there's some kind of broad prohibition against forwarding and sending emails. But I think it's really the policy and the education around the policy that controls this. And there are tools, and we have some of them in place that can track some of the data loss protection tools. You can track and monitor and control not only the data that's entering and exiting the organization, but also the emails, et cetera. So there can be periodic auditing and monitoring to assess how successful the policy enforcement is going. But as kind of an overarching principle, I think the policy drives this. It's not really about simple, basic tactical actions like auto disable and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I would tend to agree. I think the policy is a huge factor here and can be an enabler or a disabler of good communications in many cases. And we're seeing a variety of approaches to this in our customer base. Some customers have taken a very rigid policy step, just say that we don't want anything emailed at all about board level information out to our directors. And one of the reasons for that is in many cases, directors still like to use their personal account for email communications, creating a risk. Other more progressive customers have adopted, maybe a secure emailing platform or the Diligent Messenger solution for secure communications. And I think that helps when you move to a more secure platform from a secure communications tool from a platform standpoint. You can enable and help the individuals manage to that policy a little better than just leaving up to their personal choice. Obviously, anyone can communicate with another individual through any means they choose. We can't control all of that, but we can give them good policies and good tools to enable it. One of the other risks we've seen, which is really interesting, being in this space and dealing with corporate counsels and directors all the time, is that we see there's so much automation in Microsoft Outlook, or any email platform for that matter. I shouldn't single out Microsoft. But what we do is we received on many occasions sensitive emails from our customers with board level information. There was an example in our UK office of receiving some audit papers with annotations on them directed to one of the board of director members from the corporate secretary. And they had no idea that it didn't go to the right person. It went to another person with a similar name on our staff, and they had no idea. We had to alert them of it 3 hours, after the fact when we realized it, and they were aghast, of course. So this happens to us on a regular basis because we're in the space, and if we're receiving them, I'm sure other folks are. So it's really, I think, a clear and present danger that we have to be aware of as a collective industry, and think about the right policies and tools to put in place to prevent those kinds of inadvertent but high-risk mistakes that can happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm keenly interested in this, Beverly. In your role as counsel, what's your relationship with the CIO and more broadly, maybe the CISO suite, the security organization for Inovalon?
Yep. There is, again, because our business is so data-driven, there's significant interaction in my role as counsel and in my role as Chief Privacy Officer with the technology team and the technology leadership team and the Chief Information Security Officer. In addition to just those regular interactions and communications and collaborations, our security governance framework also includes what we call a Security Council, and that is comprised of the Chief Information Security Officer, our Chief Technology Officer, and me as the Privacy Officer. And that group, we meet regularly and come together to provide specific guidance regarding privacy and security issues. We review and analyze the business impact of proposed initiatives for the company and proposed strategies that may implicate our IT infrastructure. And we also oversee and review the approval of both privacy and information security policy exceptions. So we have there's a very active and engaged approach to the technology and privacy and legal departments here.
Gotcha. And with respect to the board, the directors themselves, is the CIO and the security operations team, are they spending much time thinking about their level of security and how they relate to the company, or are they kind of viewed more as almost as an external vendor or external partner to the company?
You're referring to the board itself?
To the board itself, yeah.
Right. Well, so our board happens to be very actively and interested in security matters, since it really drives our business to a certain extent. So there is a lot of communication around IT. There's a lot of communication around IT, around our IT infrastructure, around cyber risk, and all those types of things with our board. So I don't at all consider them to be kind of just an extension as I have encountered with prior boards with whom I've interacted. They're very engaged and active.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I think that the way you're approaching it would be representative of what I would consider a best practice. Unfortunately, and with many of the customers that I deal with, the CIO, I think, almost perceives the board. It's a bit of an afterthought, I think, because obviously they have big infrastructures they have to worry about, and maybe hundreds, if not thousands, of employees in many cases that are probably seen as bigger risks. Yet, when they start to perceive that the director community becomes a risk, it certainly becomes top of mind, and we are seeing a bit of a trend in that direction. In that, again, with their messaging product in particular, when CIOs perceive that directors may be communicating insecurely, it's getting raised to the top of their inbox, so to speak, and they're getting engaged in driving decision-making on putting better policies and procedures and tools in place to create better secure communication frameworks for the board. Certainly, I'd say it's happening in about 10% of cases right now, but we're seeing a trend in that direction where it's becoming top of mind, simply because you see so many public email breaches happening. And there's a term, we all are probably familiar with the term phishing, the email, the way folks penetrate email using clever emails with links in them. And there's another term called whaling, which is more of a risk for somebody at the board level. These are bigger fish, so to speak, public figures that might be more susceptible because of their public profile, like a Colin Powell, who was hacked about a year ago and exposed some private information for a public company inadvertently. So CIOs are starting to get, I think, wise to that and paying more attention to communications at the board level, from my perspective. Well, I think we talked about this a bit. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the partnership approach at Inovalon between the board and it sounds like you have some great best practices there between what you're doing with the board and IT and security in general at Inovalon. Did you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I would just reiterate. I think that connection is really important, especially with the topic of security and data protection, because that in and of itself is not a revenue generating activity, security and data protection, but it's so critical to the success and or failure of a company. So there is a partnership approach. As I said, the board is very interested and very involved and very in tune with security related matters, security related risks. So I think the biggest part, or the most prominent part of the partnership has to do with strategizing on organizational risk. So there is strong dialogue on organizational risk, cyber risk, mitigations, how it's being managed, is it effective, gauging progress achieved, and that sort of thing. And I think that the board is, at least in this instance, they're really looking for and appreciate recommendations to address significant risk areas, both those that they're aware of, for example, that were publicized, or other risks that are determined internally.
Gotcha. Steve, since we're running short on time, why don't we skip this question and go on to the next one? I think we only have a couple questions left here. So Beverly, this is obviously a very high-profile case that came up in the recent past. But in lieu of these recent big public cybersecurity incidents, is this more important, to discuss with your board? Is this top of mind? Is it status quo? Is it becoming more of an issue for you and something that, happens to be on the agenda at every board meeting? And obviously you're in the healthcare space and cybersecurity is important. So where would you say on the continuum this is today versus where it might be going in the future?
I think that it was always at the top of the continuum simply because data is such an integral part of Inovalon's business model. Those discussions were already on the forefront. So there's always a significant portion of our board discussions that deal with cybersecurity in general and cyber risk. When these types of other incidents are publicized, I mean, there's discussion around them because we like to evaluate root cause, because that once that's revealed or once it's determined, it can serve as the basis for lessons learned and best practices for us. But we already have a very robust cybersecurity dialogue ongoing. Now, I know in other roles that I have had where security is not as well understood by board members, these types of incidents actually facilitate the discussion because they're things that board members have either been directly affected by or they can relate to because they've read about them in the newspapers and seen them in the news. So to the extent that one needs a way to kind of get the board's attention, sometimes these incidents are actually helpful to at least generate some conversation.
Got it. Steve, do we have time for one last question?
Sure, one more.
Okay. So obviously, diligence in the business of helping boards and senior management collaborate and access information. Can you talk a little bit about how you're managing that in Inovalon, and are you becoming more concerned about the type of information the board and senior executives can see on a consistent basis and how they review and share that information?
I'm concerned about it just routinely concerned. I mean, we have a defined process in place, as well as role-based permissions that are required to access information internally. With respect to the board communications and confidential data are routed through a board portal, and that's really where information is posted, and that provides access for board members. As far as PHI and personally identifiable information or sensitive information or whatever the designation would be for different industries, that's not, in our instance, that's not sent to board members because there's no need, since they're not, there's no business need since it's not part of their day-to-day. But there is a concern simply because bad actors are becoming more sophisticated, and there's also, we spoke earlier about cyber risk areas of concern, the bad actors and even insider threats, not just being bad actors internally, but people also being careless and not paying attention and not following policy. That also continues to be just something that we focus on and try to mitigate to the extent possible.
Okay, well, thank you, Beverly. I appreciate your time today. I think that brings us to the end of our time together and the end of our questions. Really fascinating topic and great information from you, and I appreciate the approach Inovalon's taking to managing this at the executive and board level. It sounds like you all have really taken a best practice approach to this and have it in very good shape.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you both, Jeff and Beverly. And we wish everyone on the webinar a very happy and healthy holiday season and 2018. Hope we speak to you again sometime in the future. Have a good day.